My husband cheated. I packed my kids and drove to my parents' house. My father opened the door, looked at my 3 children standing behind me, and slowly closed it. My brother said we have no space. My sister called me impulsive. I picked up my garbage bags of clothes, walked back to my car, and whispered 3 words that would change our family forever. My name is Nia. I am 30 years old, and my family completely underestimated what a desperate mother is capable of. Before I dive into the details of exactly how I dismantled their perfect lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against the people who were supposed to protect you. The rain was coming down in absolute sheets as I pulled my battered Honda Accord up the winding, perfectly manicured driveway of my parents' estate in Buckhead. Atlanta traffic had been a nightmare, but the storm raging outside was nothing compared to the absolute hurricane inside my chest. Just an hour earlier, I had walked in on my husband Derek, a high-profile sports broker, with a woman who looked like she had barely graduated college. He did not apologize. He did not panic. He simply laughed, adjusted his expensive custom watch, and told me to get out of his house. So I grabbed cheap black plastic trash bags, stuffed whatever clothes I could find for my 3 young children, and fled into the night to the only place I thought would be a safe harbor: my parents' house. Buckhead is a neighborhood where wealth whispers from behind wrought iron gates, and my parents' mansion was the undisputed crown jewel of the block. My father, Pastor Silas, leads one of the largest and most influential megachurches in Atlanta. He and my mother, Cecilia, are practically royalty in our community. They pride themselves on absolute perfection and maintaining the flawless image of the black elite. The heavy oak door. The door I walked through every day of my childhood. The door they were now keeping shut. As I stood shivering on their massive front porch, freezing water dripping from my hair while my 5-year-old daughter clung desperately to my wet leg, the heavy oak door finally opened. The warmth of the house spilled out into the freezing storm, carrying the scent of expensive catering and the familiar sound of smooth jazz playing from hidden speakers. Inside, it was a regular Sunday evening family gathering. I could see my older sister Chloe, the golden child of the family who graduated top of her class from Howard University and became a highly successful dermatologist. Next to her stood her husband Bradley, a wealthy white venture capitalist who never missed a single chance to talk down to me. And sprawling on the custom leather sofa was my younger brother Trey, a 28-year-old man living entirely off the church payroll while contributing absolutely nothing to society. My father looked at me, then down at the dripping trash bags in my hands, then at his own grandchildren shivering in the bitter cold. His jaw tightened. "Nia, what are you doing here looking like this?" he asked, his voice low and sharp, as if my very presence might infect his pristine foyer. "Derek is cheating on me," I said, my voice trembling but loud enough for everyone inside to hear. "He kicked us out. I need a place to stay tonight just until I figure things out." My mother, Cecilia, stepped into the bright entryway, a crystal wine glass held loosely in her manicured hand. She did not rush forward to hug her freezing grandchildren. She did not offer me a towel or even ask if the kids had eaten. She took a slow sip of her wine and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "Derek just donated $100,000 to our church building fund last month," she said, her tone dripping with extreme annoyance. "How exactly do you expect your father to explain this drama to the church board?" I stared at her, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. "Mom, I said he is sleeping with another woman in our bed. He threw my children out in a storm." My mother rolled her eyes, smoothing an invisible wrinkle on her perfectly tailored dress. "A highly successful black man having a little fun on the side is nothing new, Nia. You go back there, you apologize for whatever argument you caused, and you fix your marriage. Do not come here and embarrass my AKA sorority sisters with this homeless aesthetic. We have an image to maintain in this city, and you showing up like a beggar is completely unacceptable. Go home." Chloe walked up behind my mother, crossing her arms over her designer cardigan. "Mom is right, Nia. You are always so dramatic and reactive. You cannot just pack up the kids and leave over one little mistake. This is exactly why nobody takes you seriously. You act on pure emotion instead of logic. Bradley, my arrogant brother-in-law, chuckled from the hallway, swirling the expensive bourbon in his glass. He leaned against the custom wallpaper and shook his head. "Well, Chloe," he said with that familiar condescending smirk, "this is exactly why I told you she should not have dropped out of Spelman College. 19 years old pregnant, throwing away a premier education to play house. When you rely completely on a man for your survival, you do not get to dictate the terms of the marriage. Tell her to go back and learn her place." The words felt like physical blows to my stomach. For 11 years, they had held my past over my head like a weapon. Dropping out of Spelman to have my oldest son was treated as the ultimate sin against our family legacy. In their world, degrees from elite universities, Greek letters, and visible wealth defined your humanity. Since I had none of those things, at least in their eyes, my pain was entirely irrelevant. Even Trey chimed in from the couch, not even bothering to sit up or pause his video game. "Yeah, do not bring those loud kids in here. We have zero space, and I am not giving up the guest room. I need my sleep for a big meeting tomorrow." A meeting I knew consisted of him showing up to the church office for 1 hour to collect a paycheck. I looked at the faces of the people who shared my blood. My father, the revered pastor who preached about love, grace, and sanctuary to thousands every Sunday, was actively ignoring his own shivering grandchildren on his doorstep. My mother, obsessed with her social standing, was more concerned about a donation check than her daughter's safety. My sister and her husband stood in judgment from their pedestal of wealth. There was no love here. There was only status. There was only ego. There was only cold calculation. My father placed his hand on the heavy oak door. "You need to grow up, Nia," he said coldly. "Fix your marriage. Do not come back here trying to destroy everything we have built." And with that, he slowly pushed the door shut. The lock clicked, echoing loudly over the sound of the rain. I stood there for a long moment, the cold finally seeping all the way into my bones. But the tears that had been threatening to fall completely dried up. A strange, sharp clarity washed over me, burning away the grief and leaving only pure, unbreakable focus. I bent down, picked up the wet plastic garbage bags, and ushered my kids back to the freezing Honda Accord. As I buckled my youngest into her car seat, my phone buzzed in my wet pocket. It was a text message from Derek. "I just canceled all your credit cards and emptied the joint checking account. Good luck paying for gas. Enjoy sleeping under a bridge with the kids. You should have known better than to cross me." I sat in the driver's seat, the rain pounding heavily against the windshield, blurring the bright lights of my parents' massive estate. They thought I was just a helpless, uneducated high school dropout who had wasted her life washing dishes and folding laundry. They thought I was trapped. They thought I had absolutely nothing. But they were wrong. They did not know what I had been building in the dark while they were busy looking down on me. I gripped the steering wheel, looked at the glowing windows of that mansion in my rearview mirror, and whispered 3 words into the dark car: "You will pay." You. The buzzing of the flickering neon sign outside the window was the only sound in the cheap motel room off Interstate 85. The harsh red light spilled through the thin, stained curtains, casting long shadows across the 2 double beds where my 3 children lay huddled under scratchy polyester blankets. They were exhausted from the crying, the sudden upheaval, and the sheer terror of being pushed out into the freezing storm. I sat at a wobbly veneer desk in the corner staring at the peeling wallpaper. My clothes were still damp, my bones achingly cold. The stark contrast between this damp, chemical-smelling room and the custom-designed penthouse I had scrubbed, organized, and maintained for 11 years was suffocating. Derek thought this reality would break me. My parents thought this squalor would force me to crawl back on my hands and knees begging for their conditional grace. They all believed that a woman stripped of her credit cards and her address was a woman stripped of her power. At exactly 8 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated violently against the cheap wood of the desk. The caller ID flashed the name of one of the most ruthless family law firms in Atlanta. Derek was not wasting a single second. I accepted the call and lifted the phone to my ear without saying a word. Good morning, Nia, a smooth, heavily practiced male voice said. This is Robert Hayes, lead counsel for your husband. I am calling to discuss the immediate transition of your children back to their primary residence. Derek is prepared to be generous considering the circumstances. He has authorized me to offer you a modest transition stipend of $2,000 a month for 6 months. In exchange, you will sign a full custody relinquishment form today. I watched my youngest daughter shift in her sleep, her small hands gripping the edge of the blanket. And if I refuse, I asked, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. The lawyer let out a short, patronizing sigh. Let us look at the facts, Nia. You have no college degree. You have absolutely no independent income. You have zero assets to your name. As of this morning, you do not even have a permanent address. You are currently residing in a budget motel with 3 minor children. No family court judge in the state of Georgia is going to look favorably on a homeless, unemployed mother who dropped out of college. Derek is offering you a clean exit. If you fight this, we will drag your lack of education and resources through the mud. You will lose the kids and you will get absolutely nothing. Do the logical thing. The threat hung heavy in the stale air of the motel room. It was the exact narrative my family had weaponized against me for my entire adult life. The helpless, uneducated girl who ruined her life with an early pregnancy. Derek was betting his entire strategy on that exact persona. He truly believed he possessed all the leverage. Draft the paperwork and send it to my email, I said softly. Excellent choice, Nia. I will have it to you within the hour, the lawyer replied, his tone dripping with the satisfaction of an easy victory. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk. I did not bury my face in my hands. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I reached down into the heavy black trash bag resting by my feet. Beneath the hastily packed sweaters and children's pajamas, my fingers wrapped around cold, brushed aluminum. I pulled out a thick, heavy 5-year-old laptop. It was not a sleek, modern machine. It was a customized, modified workhorse that I had upgraded piece by piece over the years. I flipped the screen open. The glow of the monitor illuminated the dark bags under my eyes. A complex command terminal instantly filled the screen with lines of rapidly scrolling green text. My fingers hit the keyboard, flying across the keys with a speed and precision that would have left my arrogant family completely speechless. For 7 years, while Derek was out entertaining clients and sleeping with barely legal interns, I was awake at 2 in the morning. While my mother was hosting lavish charity galas to boost her social standing, I was taking advanced online courses in machine learning, predictive modeling, and data architecture. When you are treated like you are invisible, you learn how to operate in the shadows. I knew that relying on a man who constantly reminded me of my financial dependence was a trap, so I built an escape hatch. Under the glowing screen, I was no longer Nia the Spellman dropout. I logged into my secure encrypted server under my legal business alias N.A. Sterling. It was a deliberately gender-neutral, race-neutral name that I had registered through a blind trust in Delaware. In the highly competitive male-dominated tech sector, nobody questioned the identity of N.A. Sterling because N.A. Sterling produced results that generated millions. Over the course of 3 years, from the corner of my kitchen counter while pureeing baby food and folding laundry, I had coded a proprietary artificial intelligence system. It was an advanced predictive algorithm designed to analyze commercial real estate risks. My software scraped municipal zoning shifts, demographic trends, environmental impact reports, and hidden market fluctuations to predict property value crashes before they ever happened. It was a digital crystal ball for venture capitalists, and the absolute pinnacle of irony was my biggest client. I navigated through the administrative dashboard, my eyes scanning the active user licenses. There it was. Apex Capital Partners, the venture capital fund owned and operated by my brother-in-law, Bradley. A bitter smile crossed my face as I thought back to Thanksgiving dinner just 5 months ago. We were all sitting around my parents' massive dining table. Bradley had been swirling a glass of expensive scotch, loudly boasting to my father about his firm's incredible quarterly returns. He claimed he had secured exclusive rights to a revolutionary AI software from a reclusive tech genius named Sterling. It analyzes risk variables my own analysts cannot even see. Bradley had bragged, puffing out his chest. We are dominating the Atlanta commercial market because of this code. I had been passing the mashed potatoes at the time. I politely asked him how the algorithm weighed municipal zoning delays against inflation rates. Bradley had stopped, looked at me like I was a toddler asking about quantum physics, and let out a loud, condescending laugh. He patted my hand and told me not to worry my pretty head about it. It is complex mathematics, Nia, he had said, smirking at Chloe. Stick to organizing the kids' playdates. Let the adults handle the millions. He had no idea that the brilliant, reclusive tech genius he was paying $40,000 a month to lease that software from was the very woman serving him dinner. My algorithm was the entire backbone of his current investment strategy. Apex Capital had tied up nearly $50 million in commercial real estate deals this week alone, relying completely on my system's risk assessment protocols to approve the transactions. I stared at the screen. The lawyer's voice echoed in my head. You have zero assets. You are unemployed. You are homeless. I clicked into the master control panel for Apex Capital's active license. The screen displayed their live data feed. They were currently running a massive risk analysis on a new downtown development project. Bradley was likely sitting in his corner office right now, smug and secure, waiting for my code to give him the green light to move his investors' money. He had stood in my parents' hallway last night and laughed at my pain. He had called me a parasite. He had cheered while my father threw me and my children out into the freezing rain. He thought I was powerless. My finger hovered directly over the primary execution key. I looked back at my 3 children sleeping soundly despite the cold, damp air of the motel. I was not going to be a victim. I was not going to let them strip me of my babies. I was going to tear down the very foundation of their arrogance brick by digital brick. I pressed the enter key. The command executed instantly. A bright red banner flashed across my screen. License revoked. Server access terminated. In a fraction of a second, I completely wiped Apex Capital out of the system, blinding Bradley's firm in the middle of their biggest trading day of the year. The heavy mahogany doors of my parents' Buckhead estate were unlocked, as they always were on a Sunday afternoon following my father's sermon. I pushed the door open, the heavy fabric of Trey's old winter coat draped over my arm. I had found it in the trunk of my Honda, a leftover artifact from when I used to do his laundry, because he claimed the dry cleaners ruined his clothes. Returning it was my excuse to step back into the lion's den. I needed to see the immediate fallout of what I had set in motion. The scent of slow-roasted lamb and expensive rosemary candles filled the grand foyer, but the usual post-church classical music was entirely absent. Instead, the sprawling house echoed with the sound of pure, unadulterated panic. "What do you mean it is permanently locked?" a voice bellowed from the formal living room. It was Bradley. I walked quietly across the imported marble floor, stopping just outside the arched entryway. Bradley was pacing frantically in front of the custom stone fireplace. His usually immaculate blonde hair was disheveled, and his expensive silk tie was yanked loose around his neck. He had his phone pressed so hard against his ear his knuckles were turning white. "Bypass the firewall," he screamed into the receiver. His face flushed an ugly shade of red. "I do not pay you people 6 figures a year to tell me a system is locked. We are bleeding $5 million since the market opened. The European portfolio is completely exposed. Call the developer. Call Sterling immediately." I stood in the shadows of the archway, my face perfectly still. He was screaming for N.A. Sterling. He was screaming for me. My sister Chloe sat perched on the edge of a velvet armchair, nursing a mimosa and watching her husband with tight, anxious eyes. She hated seeing Bradley lose control because his control was the foundation of her immense social superiority. Her gaze snapped away from her sweating husband and landed directly on me. Her eyes narrowed instantly, taking in my damp clothes and the exhaustion written across my face. "What are you doing back here?" Chloe asked, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a jagged knife. I stepped fully into the living room and held out the heavy jacket. I brought Trey his coat. I found it in my trunk. Trey, who was stretched out on the opposite sofa, rolled his eyes and snatched the coat from my hands without a word of thanks. He tossed it onto the floor as if my touch had contaminated the fabric. Chloe stood up, smoothing the front of her designer dress. She walked toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. Bradley is actively losing millions of dollars right now, she said, her voice dropping into a harsh, vicious whisper. Can you take your cheap motel smell out of our living room? This house does not harbor Spellman dropouts who cannot even keep their own husbands happy. My mother Cecilia walked into the room carrying a silver tray of appetizers. She did not reprimand Chloe. She did not ask where my 3 children were. She simply looked at my outfit and sighed in deep theatrical disappointment. Chloe is absolutely right, Nia, my mother said, placing the tray down with a sharp clatter. We are dealing with a massive financial crisis right now. Bradley's firm is under a targeted cyber attack. We do not have the time or the emotional bandwidth to deal with your perpetual victim routine. Go back to Derek and beg for forgiveness before you end up on welfare. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who cared more about a venture capital fund than the fact that her grandchildren had slept in a damp motel room. Then I looked at Bradley. He had ended his call and was furiously dialing another number, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the phone onto the plush rug. He cursed loudly, scrambling to pick it up. I cannot reach them, he gasped, looking up at Chloe with genuine terror in his eyes. Sterling revoked our master license. The entire risk analysis grid is blind. Every single commercial real estate deal we structured for the quarter is suspended. If we do not get the algorithm back online by tomorrow morning, the fund is going to face insolvency. Investors will pull everything. Chloe rushed to his side, placing a manicured hand on his trembling shoulder. Bradley, calm down. Who is this Sterling person? Just throw more money at them. Buy the software outright. We have the capital. You do not understand, Bradley shot back, rubbing his face aggressively. Anna Sterling is a ghost. We only communicate through encrypted portals. The code is proprietary. Nobody else on the market has anything close to this predictive modeling. We cannot just buy it if they refuse to sell. They hold all the leverage. I stood perfectly still, letting their panic wash over me. For 11 years they had told me I was useless. For 11 years Bradley had mocked my lack of a degree, telling everyone that my only skill was changing diapers. Now the powerful, highly educated venture capitalist was hyperventilating in his luxurious living room because a mother of 3 had pressed a single button on a 5-year-old laptop. Right at that exact moment, my cell phone vibrated heavily against my hip. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. The screen lit up with a high-priority encrypted email notification. It was a message from my legal representative at the Blind Trust in Delaware. I opened the message and read the bold text on the screen. Official acquisition offer received. Horizon Tech Valley Conglomerate has completed their initial review of the N.A. Sterling algorithm. They are placing a baseline valuation of the software at $40 million. They are requesting an immediate meeting to discuss purchasing a 51% stake. $40 million. I slowly locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. My heartbeat was steady. My mind was razor sharp. I looked up and met Bradley's frantic, bloodshot eyes. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to redial a number that I had permanently disconnected. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, calculating curve of the lips that made Chloe take a physical step back. You are right, Chloe, I said softly, my voice completely devoid of the fear they were so used to hearing. I should leave. I would not want to track failure onto your expensive rugs, especially when Bradley seems to be doing such a great job of failing all on his own. I turned on my heel and walked out of the formal living room, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open behind me. I did not need to beg for shelter. I did not need to ask for their scraps. I was holding the key to their complete financial destruction, and I was going to watch their empire burn to the ground. 2 weeks later, the heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Family Court felt entirely different from the doors of my parents' estate. Here the air was sterile and freezing, smelling faintly of floor wax and institutional desperation. I sat completely alone at the long wooden respondent table. I wore a simple tailored navy suit. My hair was pulled back into a neat, immaculate bun. My posture was perfectly straight. I did not fidget. I did not look nervously around the room. I simply sat with my hands folded over a single unmarked manila folder resting on the table in front of me. Directly across the aisle, Derek was putting on a masterclass in performative arrogance. He wore a custom Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than the motel room I had stayed in for the past 14 days. He was leaning back in his chair, casually checking his expensive watch, acting as though this custody hearing was nothing more than an inconvenient delay in his otherwise spectacular life. Next to him sat Robert Hayes, the shark of a family lawyer, who had tried to intimidate me over the phone. Hayes was organizing a massive stack of legal binders, shooting me occasional glances, filled with absolute unfiltered pity. They had looked at the empty chair beside me and immediately concluded that I was too broke and too terrified to even secure legal representation. When Honorable Judge Davis entered the courtroom, the low murmur of chatter ceased instantly. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman with decades of experience dealing with broken families. She took her seat at the high bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked down at the docket. "We are here for the emergency custody hearing regarding the minor children of Derek and Nia Sterling," Judge Davis announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "I see the petitioner is represented by Mr. Hayes." She looked over the rim of her glasses at me. "Mrs. Sterling, the court record indicates you have not retained counsel. Are you representing yourself in this matter?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice clear and unwavering. Hayes let out a short, audible scoff. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical flourish. "Your Honor, we are filing for immediate permanent physical and legal custody of the 3 minor children. My client has been the sole financial provider for the entirety of this 11-year marriage. The respondent, Mrs. Sterling, is a college dropout who has not held a single job since she was 19 years old. 2 weeks ago, she suffered what we can only describe as a severe mental break. She kidnapped the children in the middle of a storm and took them to a notorious unsanitary motel on the edge of the highway. She has no income, no savings, and no permanent residence. She is fundamentally incapable of providing a safe environment." The judge frowned, making a note on her legal pad. "Those are serious allegations, counselor. Do you have evidence of this mental instability?" "We do, Your Honor," Hayes said smoothly. "We have a character witness who can attest to Mrs. Sterling's long history of erratic and dangerous behavior. I would like to call Chloe Vance to the stand." I did not flinch, but I felt the temperature in the room drop. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and my older sister walked down the center aisle. Chloe looked like she had stepped directly out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. She wore a pristine white Chanel suit, her hair perfectly blown out, carrying herself with the graceful manufactured sorrow of a woman who thrived on tragedy, as long as it was not her own. She did not look at me once as she walked up to the witness stand and swore to tell the truth. "Please state your relationship to the respondent," Hayes asked, pacing slowly in front of the stand. "I am her older sister," Chloe said, letting her voice tremble perfectly. "And can you describe your sister's mental state over the past few years?" Chloe took a deep, dramatic breath, dabbing the corner of her dry eye with a tissue. "It breaks my heart to say this, but Nia has always been profoundly unstable. She dropped out of Spelman College because she could not handle the pressure. Derek has been an absolute saint, carrying the entire weight of their family while she spiraled. She is prone to intense manic episodes. She lives in a fantasy world. When she showed up at my parents' house 2 weeks ago, soaking wet and dragging her children through the freezing rain, she was completely hysterical. We tried to help her, but she lashed out aggressively. Taking those poor children to a filthy motel was not an act of necessity. It was an act of pure, spiteful vengeance. I genuinely fear for my nieces and nephews if they remain in her custody." Derek nodded solemnly from his table, looking the picture of a tragic, long-suffering father. I watched my sister commit perjury with the same casual ease she used to order a latte. My own blood willing to declare me an unfit mother just to maintain her social alliance with Derek and preserve my parents' flawless reputation. They truly believed that if they repeated the lie often enough, the law would make it the truth. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," Hayes said, turning to the judge with a grave expression. "Your Honor, the facts are indisputable. The respondent is a destitute, unstable flight risk. We ask that the children be transitioned to my client's luxury residence immediately. Chloe stepped down from the stand, finally shooting me a fleeting, venomous look before taking a seat in the gallery. Judge Davis sighed heavily and turned her attention to me. Her eyes held a mixture of professional duty and genuine concern. Mrs. Sterling, your sister has painted a very disturbing picture of your capability to parent. You have no legal counsel. You have not submitted any employment records. If you cannot provide this court with proof of stable housing and immediate verifiable income, I will have no choice but to grant emergency custody to your husband. Do you have anything to present? I stood up slowly. I picked up the single manila folder from the table. Yes, Your Honor. I would like to submit my financial disclosures and proof of residence to the court. I walked over and handed the folder to the bailiff. He split the contents, handing one thick stack of paper up to the judge's bench and dropping the identical copy onto the table right in front of Derek and his highly paid lawyer. I walked back to my seat and stood tall, waiting. The courtroom fell into an absolute suffocating silence. Judge Davis adjusted her glasses. She looked at the first page. She blinked. She took off her glasses, wiped them with a cloth, put them back on, and looked at the page again. The professional neutrality on her face vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. At the opposing table, Robert Hayes was aggressively flipping through his copy. His confident theatrical posture completely dissolved. He paled, his eyes darting frantically across the black ink of the certified bank statement. Your Honor. Hayes stammered, his voice suddenly an octave higher. This must be a fabrication. This is a blatant forgery. My client's wife has not generated a single dollar of income in 11 years. She folds laundry. Judge Davis ignored him. She was staring at the raised holographic seal at the bottom of the page. Mr. Hayes, this is a certified notarized statement directly from the executive branch of Chase Wealth Management. This is not a forgery. Derek, unable to handle the sudden shift in the room, snatched the paper out of his lawyer's hands. He stared at the bold, highlighted number at the bottom of the deposit ledger. $15 million. It was a wire transfer cleared and settled into an account held solely under my name, executed just 48 hours ago. Derek shot up out of his chair, ignoring Hayes, who was desperately grabbing his sleeve, trying to pull him back down. His face was a mask of furious, misogynistic disbelief. $15 million, he practically yelled, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Are you completely out of your mind? Where did you get that kind of cash, Nia? Who are you sleeping with? Some Silicon Valley billionaire. Your college fund ran out a decade ago. You are a high school graduate who watches daytime television. You do not have a dime to your name. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, vibrating energy. I simply looked at the judge and spoke with quiet, absolute authority. Your Honor, that $15 million deposit is the first cash royalty payment from Horizon Tech Valley. For the past 7 years, while my husband was under the impression I was exclusively managing his household, I designed, coded, and patented a proprietary artificial intelligence system for commercial real estate risk analysis under the corporate alias N.A. Sterling. 3 days ago, Horizon Tech Valley acquired a 51% stake in my software. The total valuation of my company is $40 million. I am currently the majority shareholder and the sole owner of the liquid capital you see on that statement. The silence that followed was absolute. Chloe, sitting in the gallery, looked as if all the air had been violently sucked out of her lungs. Her jaw hung open, her perfect Chanel suit suddenly looking incredibly insignificant. Hayes was completely frozen, staring at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air. But I was not finished. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a second, smaller document. I handed it to the bailiff, who silently walked it over and placed it directly onto Derek's table. Actually, Derek, I earned every single penny of that money, I said, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. But that bank statement is not the document you should be worried about right now. Take a look at the second page. Derek's hands were actually shaking as he looked down at the paper. It was not a bank statement. It was a deed transfer. Since your venture capital friends at Apex experienced that massive, unexpected market failure last week, I continued, my voice smooth and perfectly even. Their asset freeze caused a severe ripple effect in your personal investment portfolio. Your bank panicked. They quietly auctioned off the high-risk mortgage debt to your luxury penthouse to private investors to recoup their potential losses. I bought the note in full yesterday afternoon. In cash. Derek stood frozen, the color completely draining from his face as the reality of my words hit him. So I concluded, turning back to address the judge with a calm, polite smile. I can assure the court that my children will not be living in a motel. They will be returning to the exact same home they have lived in for the past 6 years. Because as of yesterday, Derek is currently standing in front of a judge fighting for custody in a penthouse that I legally own. 12 months can completely rewrite the hierarchy of power in a family that values money over blood. Over the past year, the dust from my explosive court appearance had settled into a new, undeniable reality. Derek had been utterly humiliated, forced to vacate his penthouse and hand over full custody of my 3 children while battling a mountain of legal fees he could no longer afford. Bradley's venture capital firm had barely survived the catastrophic blackout of my artificial intelligence software. They lost crucial investors. Their reputation in the Atlanta financial sector was permanently tarnished, and Chloe had been forced to quietly sell off several of her designer handbags just to keep up the appearance of their lavish lifestyle. Meanwhile, Horizon Tech Valley had wired the remaining balance of my acquisition buyout. I was no longer a discarded housewife living in a damp motel. I was a major player in the tech industry, sitting on a liquid fortune that my family could not even begin to comprehend. Yet despite their very public financial bleeding, my parents clung desperately to their illusion of supreme social dominance. The air conditioning in the Buckhead Cartier boutique was set to a crisp 68 degrees, a perfect climate for preserving both priceless diamonds and icy social hierarchies. I walked through the heavy brass and glass doors, my heels making absolutely no sound on the plush custom-woven carpets. I was not wearing flashy logos or trying to prove my worth through obvious labels. My outfit was a masterclass in stealth wealth. I wore a custom-tailored Loro Piana cashmere coat draped elegantly over my shoulders, paired with a simple Brunello Cucinelli silk blouse and tailored trousers. The only piece of jewelry I wore was a flawless 3-carat emerald-cut diamond ring I had bought for myself to celebrate my company hitting its first major expansion milestone. Across the gleaming showroom, perched on velvet viewing stools, sat my mother and my sister. They were preparing for my father's 30th pastoral anniversary gala. It was an event that required them to outshine every other woman in Atlanta's high society, a desperate attempt to prove to their congregation that the Silas family was still blessed, untouchable, and financially superior. Chloe was pointing aggressively at a velvet tray lined with thick diamond tennis bracelets, while my mother held a spectacular vintage platinum and sapphire necklace up to her throat, admiring her reflection in the gilded antique mirror resting on the counter. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I could catch fragments of their conversation as I approached. Chloe was complaining about Bradley's shrinking bonuses while my mother shushed her, reminding her that maintaining the image of prosperity was more important than actual wealth. I stopped a few feet behind them, letting the silence announce my presence. Chloe noticed me first through the reflection in the glass display case. Her hand froze in midair. She turned around slowly, taking in my appearance. Her eyes darted from the immaculate cut of my coat to the quiet, undeniable authority in my posture. Her face tightened with immediate defensive malice. "What are you doing here?" Chloe demanded, her voice cutting sharply through the hushed, reverent atmosphere of the boutique. Cecilia turned around, dropping the heavy sapphire necklace back onto the velvet display pad. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in a familiar, deeply ingrained sneer. She still wanted to believe I was the terrified girl standing on her porch in the rain. "Nia, this is a private viewing for preferred clients," my mother said, her tone dripping with manufactured condescension. "You cannot just wander in here off the street because you managed to swindle a lucky settlement out of Derek. We are conducting important family business. Security." She snapped her manicured fingers aggressively toward the towering armed guard standing near the entrance. Escort this woman out. She is harassing us and disrupting a private appointment. The guard shifted his weight and took a tentative step forward, reading the tension in the room. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not revert to the emotional, pleading daughter they were so accustomed to breaking. I simply stepped up to the counter, raised my right hand, and tapped my index finger twice against the reinforced glass of the display case. The sharp sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Before the guard could take another step, the heavy mahogany door at the back of the showroom flew open. Out rushed Henri, the regional director of the boutique, practically stumbling over his own polished leather shoes in his frantic haste. He completely bypassed my mother and sister, entirely ignoring their indignant expressions. Mrs. Sterling. Henry gasped, bowing his head slightly in a gesture reserved strictly for clients whose investment portfolios dictated global market trends. I am so incredibly sorry. We did not expect you until this afternoon. The private viewing suite upstairs is currently being prepped with the specific estate pieces you requested from Paris. Please let me get you a glass of champagne while you wait. My mother's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. Chloe looked as if she had been physically struck by a heavy object. They were witnessing firsthand the terrifying reality of untouchable institutional wealth. They were watching the man who usually treated them with polite tolerance bend over backward to accommodate the daughter they had thrown away like trash. I looked down at the velvet tray they had been agonizing over for the past hour, examining the tennis bracelets and the statement pieces they were desperately trying to figure out how to afford on credit. Henri Therther said smoothly, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. Wrap up this entire tray of diamonds. Put it on my account. Henri nodded frantically, signaling for two clerks to immediately begin boxing the fortune. My mother snapped out of her shock. She instinctively reached out and grabbed the vintage platinum and sapphire necklace she had been admiring, clutching it tightly against her chest. You cannot do this, she hissed, her face flushing a deep mottled crimson. I have already laid claim to this piece for the anniversary gala. Your father specifically set aside church funds for my appearance this weekend. You cannot just walk in here and buy it out from under me. I looked at the necklace clutched in her desperate grip, then calmly met her furious gaze. I will take that one as well, Henri, I said. But Mrs. Sterling Henri hesitated, glancing nervously at my mother. That piece is a historic design. I smiled, and the coldness in my eyes made Henri immediately step back. I want to buy it and bring it directly to my refinery. Melt it down. The design is entirely too tacky for my taste. Chloe gasped loudly, clutching her chest. My mother slammed her hands down on the glass counter, her pristine, pious socialite mask entirely shattered. You vindictive, ungrateful brat! My mother spat, her voice trembling with absolute rage. You think money makes you untouchable. You think you can disrespect this family. I am calling your father right now. I am telling Pastor Silas exactly how you are treating your own flesh and blood. He will publicly humiliate you from the pulpit this Sunday. He will destroy whatever reputation you think you have built. She reached into her designer bag, aggressively pulling out her phone with shaking hands, desperate to summon the patriarchal authority that had ruled our family for decades. I did not back away. I stepped directly into her personal space, invading the bubble of fake righteousness she had hidden behind her entire life. I leaned down until my lips were merely inches from her ear. Call him, I whispered in my voice, a deadly calm promise. Call Pastor Silas right now. And while you have him on the line, ask him exactly where he spent $200,000 of the church building fund last weekend in Las Vegas. Because the offshore accounts he used are routed through a secure financial server I currently own. My mother's phone slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the thick, custom-woven carpet with a dull thud. She could not speak. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and terrified under the harsh, bright lights of the display case. I turned away, completely ignoring Chloe's sputtering, indignant gasps, and walked out of the Cartier boutique with my head held high. Henri followed me all the way to the glass doors, bowing slightly and promising that the deliveries would be made to my private, secure vault before sunset. I stepped out into the warm Atlanta air, perfectly calm, I knew the bomb I had just dropped would detonate long before the end of the week. I did not have to wait long. 3 days later, my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed my brother's name. It was Trey. When I answered, he sounded entirely out of breath, his usual arrogant, entitled drawl completely replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. He demanded I come to the Buckhead estate immediately. I almost declined the invitation. I had a multi-million-dollar company to run and a board meeting to prepare for. But the sheer vibrating terror in his voice told me that the foundation of the Silas family empire was currently cracking right down the middle. I wanted a front row seat to the collapse. I drove my new armored Mercedes to the estate and walked straight through the heavy front doors. The atmosphere inside the house was completely toxic. Shouting echoed down the long hallway originating from my father's private study. I walked down the corridor, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and stood quietly in the open doorway. The study looked like a tornado had ripped through it. Drawers were yanked open and thrown onto the floor. Leather-bound financial ledgers were scattered across the expensive Persian rug. Trey was standing behind the massive mahogany desk, gripping a thick stack of legal documents. His face was flushed red with exertion and absolute rage. My father, Pastor Silas, sat slumped in his favorite leather wingback chair, his face buried deep in his trembling hands. My mother, Cecilia, was pacing nervously near the stone fireplace, clutching a crystal glass of scotch so tightly I thought it might shatter in her grip. "What exactly did you do?" Trey yelled, throwing a heavy document onto the center of the desk. "I was looking for the quarterly tax filings, Dad. Instead, I find a commercial lien. You mortgaged the church. You took the original deeds to the main sanctuary, the community center, and the south parking lot, and you legally signed them over to Bradley." I leaned against the wooden doorframe, crossing my arms over my silk blouse. The $200,000 in Las Vegas was just the tip of the iceberg. Pastor Silas had literally gambled with the holy ground he preached on every single Sunday. My father looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading for understanding. "It was a temporary bridge loan, Trey. Bradley told me he had a guaranteed venture capital project, a massive commercial tech hub in Austin. He promised me a 300% return within 6 months. The church building fund was severely depleted. I needed the capital to finish the new cathedral wing before the anniversary gala. Bradley swore the investment was bulletproof. It was a ghost project," Trey shot back, his voice cracking with stress. "I just ran the LLC through the state corporate database. The company Bradley invested the church's money in does not exist. It is a shell corporation registered to a P.O. box. Bradley got completely scammed, and he used the church's property to finance the loss." My mother stopped pacing. She looked at my father, then at Trey, and finally her eyes landed on me standing quietly in the doorway. The realization of their total financial ruin should have made her hold her husband accountable. Instead, her mind desperately sought a familiar scapegoat. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "This is your fault," my mother shrieked, the glass of scotch trembling dangerously in her hand. "You brought this disaster into our home." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused by the sheer pathetic absurdity of her logic. "My fault. I am sorry, Cecilia. Did I forge Dad's signature on a commercial mortgage document? Did I force him to hand over the church deeds to his incompetent, arrogant son-in-law?" "You are a curse!" she yelled, taking an aggressive step toward me. "Ever since you dropped out of Spelman, you have brought nothing but shame and bad luck to this family. You humiliated Chloe and me at the boutique. You maliciously destroyed your marriage with Derek. And now you have brought this dark, terrible energy onto your father. We were blessed before you started rebelling against us. God is punishing this family because of your disobedience." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed loudly in the heavy silence of the study. "God is not punishing you, Mother. Basic accounting is punishing you. You have spent decades pretending to be morally and financially superior, funding your luxurious lifestyle on credit debt and church tithes. Now the bill has finally come due, and you do not have the funds to cover it." Before she could unleash another hysterical, baseless accusation, the front door of the estate slammed open with incredible force. Heavy, frantic footsteps echoed down the hallway. Bradley burst into the study. He looked completely destroyed. His usually pristine blonde hair was matted with sweat to his forehead. His expensive silk tie was missing, and the top buttons of his tailored shirt were ripped open. Chloe trailed close behind him, her face stained with dark mascara, tears sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Bradley stopped dead in the center of the room, looking frantically at my father. "Silas, we have a massive problem," Bradley gasped, leaning over and resting his hands on his knees as he struggled to catch his breath. "Apex Financial just executed a hostile takeover of my entire venture capital fund. They locked me out of the main accounts an hour ago. The risk algorithms collapsed. Everything is gone." My father stood up slowly, his hands gripping the leather armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean everything is gone? What about the Austin Tech Hub? What about the church's collateral?" Bradley ran a trembling hand over his face, completely avoiding my father's desperate eyes. "The Austin project was a total fraud. The developers took the capital and vanished overnight. Because my firm was completely exposed, Apex is liquidating all my remaining assets to cover their institutional losses. They are aggressively calling in every outstanding note we hold." Trey stepped out from behind the desk, his fists clenched tight at his sides, his chest heaving. "What exactly are you saying, Bradley? Speak clearly." Bradley swallowed hard, looking physically ill. "Apex took the collateral assignment. They legally hold the mortgage to the church now. The grace period expired at midnight last night. They are executing the foreclosure immediately. The federal marshals are going to padlock the sanctuary doors on Monday morning." My mother dropped her glass. It shattered violently against the stone hearth, the amber liquid pooling over the bricks. My father fell backward into his chair, clutching his chest as if he had been physically shot. The great Pastor Silas, the undisputed moral authority of Atlanta, the man who had judged my every mistake, was about to be publicly evicted from his own pulpit. Chloe fell to her knees on the rug, weeping hysterically about losing her country club membership and her social standing. "You have to fix this," my father pleaded, looking at Bradley with absolute pathetic desperation. "You have to call them right now. Tell them we will set up a payment plan. Tell them anything. The anniversary gala is this Sunday. The mayor is attending. The governor is attending. We cannot lose the building." "I have zero leverage," Silas Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Apex froze my personal banking accounts. I cannot even pay my own residential mortgage right now. The church is gone. We are completely bankrupt." They were cornered. There were no more bridge loans to secure, no more favors to call in, no more wealthy congregants to manipulate into giving donations. The grand, glittering illusion of the Silas family was burning straight to the ground, and they were completely trapped inside the fire. I stood perfectly still in the doorway, wearing my custom-tailored suit, holding the power of a $40 million tech empire, watching the architects of my childhood, misery, weep over the ashes of their fake reputation. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply stood there, breathing in the sweet scent of their absolute destruction as they realized they had reached a terrifying, inescapable dead end. The news of my financial elevation did not stay contained within the four walls of my father's ruined study. In Atlanta, wealth of that magnitude was a gravitational pull, and within days, the city's elite circles were buzzing with the terrifying reality of N.A. Sterling. Derek, however, refused to accept his new reality. Evicted from his custom penthouse and bleeding cash from mounting legal fees, his massive ego could not process the fact that the woman he had spent a decade belittling had orchestrated his complete downfall. He needed to destroy me, not in a courtroom where he had already been humiliated, but in the court of public opinion. He found a willing accomplice in my sister. Chloe was cornered, stripped of her Cartier dreams, and facing imminent foreclosure on her own mansion. Together they decided that if they could not have my money, they would ensure I could not enjoy it either. Derek reached out to the chief editor of the Atlanta Chronicle, the city's most ruthless and widely read urban tabloid. It was a publication notorious for tearing down local celebrities, politicians, and business moguls with sensationalized, unverified leaks. Derek offered them an exclusive multi-part exposé. He promised to reveal that my tech fortune was a complete fabrication, a massive money laundering scheme funded by illicit offshore accounts. To cement the narrative, Chloe provided the physical evidence. She tapped into her remaining social connections to secure forged medical documents from a disgraced private clinic. The files claimed I had a long documented history of severe paranoid delusions, painting me as a dangerously unstable woman who had stolen her husband's assets during a psychotic break. They wanted a massive cash payout for the story, the tabloid salivating at the prospect of taking down the city's newest, most mysterious billionaire, drafted a vicious front-page feature overnight. They severely underestimated the capabilities of the artificial intelligence software I had created. My security algorithms flagged the digital transmission of my name and the forged medical records before the tabloid's editorial board even finished formatting the article. I was sitting in my newly acquired corner office overlooking the city skyline when my lead security director handed me the intercepted draft. I read the vicious lies my ex-husband and my own flesh and blood had constructed. They were going to publish the article at noon the following day. My legal team immediately drafted a barrage of cease and desist orders, preparing to file an emergency injunction for defamation and libel. I held up my hand, stopping my lead attorney mid-sentence. "Do not send the injunction," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. My attorney looked at me in total confusion. "Mrs. Sterling, if they run this story, it could cause temporary fluctuations in Horizon Tech's stock valuation. The forged medical records alone are incredibly damaging. We have to shut this down immediately." "I am going to shut it down," I replied, turning my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows. "But lawsuits take months. They generate headlines and give Derek exactly the kind of prolonged media attention he is begging for. I do not want to fight a public relations war with a gutter publication. Find out exactly who owns the parent company of the Atlanta Chronicle." Within 20 minutes, my financial analyst delivered the dossier. The tabloid was the primary asset of a struggling local media conglomerate. They were highly leveraged, carrying massive operational debt and desperate for an infusion of capital. "Call their board of directors," I instructed my lead acquisitions manager. "Tell them N.A. Sterling is offering a direct hostile cash buyout for 51% of their voting shares. Offer them 20% over market value effective immediately. Tell them the offer expires at dawn." My acquisitions manager blinked, completely stunned. "You want to buy a failing tabloid company just to kill a single article? The return on investment is abysmal." I smiled, a cold, sharp curve of my lips. "It is not an investment. It is an extermination fee. Get it done. Money moves faster than malice." By 4 o'clock in the morning, while Derek was sleeping in his cheap rental apartment, dreaming of his media payout, the contracts were signed, sealed, and executed. The massive wire transfer cleared before the sun even rose. I was now the majority shareholder and acting chairwoman of the very publication Derek was relying on to destroy my life. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Derek walked through the glass doors of the Atlanta Chronicle headquarters. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, trying desperately to project the image of a wealthy, wronged executive rather than a destitute, defeated ex-husband. He walked with a swagger that suggested he had already won. He approached the main reception desk, flashing his most arrogant smile, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had fundamentally shifted overnight. "I am here to see Marcus Thorne," Derek announced, leaning casually against the high counter. "We have an exclusive syndication contract to sign this morning regarding the Nia Sterling expose." The receptionist, who had been briefed on the massive corporate restructuring just an hour prior, gave him a tight, deeply uncomfortable smile. She typed a quick message into her terminal. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. The executive team is expecting you. Please take the private elevator straight to the top floor. The publisher's office is at the end of the hall." Derek adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed out with arrogant satisfaction as he stepped into the elevator. He believed he was about to sign a document that would ruin my reputation, invalidate my corporate standing, and force me to settle with him for millions just to make the scandal disappear. He walked down the plush, quiet corridor of the executive suite and approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the publisher's office. He did not bother to knock. He simply pushed the doors open, ready to demand his money and his revenge. The corner office was spectacular, featuring panoramic views of the city Derek used to run. Behind the massive polished granite desk sat a high-backed leather chair currently swiveled around to face the sprawling view of the skyline. "Marcus, let us get this paperwork finalized," Derek said, tossing his leather briefcase onto the pristine surface of the desk with a heavy thud. "I want the money wired to my account by noon, and I want the article live immediately after. Chloe is standing by to confirm the medical records with your legal department. Let us drop the hammer on this fraud." The room was entirely silent. The leather chair did not move. Derek frowned, stepping further into the room. "Did you hear me? I said let us get this signed. I have places to be." Slowly, deliberately, the high-backed leather chair swiveled around. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting elegantly on the armrests. I wore a sharp crimson suit that contrasted violently with the sterile corporate tones of the room. I looked directly into Derek's eyes. I watched the arrogant swagger completely evaporate from his posture. I watched the blood rush out of his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His eyes darted around the office, searching desperately for the publisher he thought he was meeting, suddenly realizing the horrific magnitude of his mistake. "Good morning, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. "Marcus no longer occupies this office. You are speaking to the new majority shareholder of this publication. Now you are saying something about wanting a payout." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. He looked from me to the massive mahogany desk, then to the two imposing security guards who had silently stepped into the room behind him. He reached for the forged medical files he had brought, but my hand slammed down on the manila envelope first. I slid it across the polished granite, right into the industrial shredder sitting beside my chair. The harsh grinding noise filled the room, erasing his entire pathetic blackmail scheme in 3 seconds. "You have absolutely nothing left, Derek," I told him, leaning forward so he could see the absolute zero in my eyes. "You have no penthouse. You have no children. You have no leverage. And if you ever try to contact a journalist in this city again, I will personally ensure you spend the next decade drowning in litigation. Get out of my building." While Derek was being escorted out the back service elevator, a broken shell of a man, my actual targets were driving toward the Horizon Tech Valley Regional Headquarters. Bradley Vance was a man running completely out of time. Apex Financial had given him exactly 72 hours to produce a miracle. If he could not reacquire the N.A. Sterling predictive algorithm, his venture capital fund would be entirely liquidated, his personal assets seized, and my father's church padlocked by federal marshals. Bradley had spent 2 days frantically begging my corporate liaisons for a face-to-face meeting with the elusive founder. He was so blindingly desperate that he never once stopped to question why the meeting had suddenly miraculously been approved. He did not come alone. Chloe accompanied him, dressed in a form-fitting crimson Tom Ford dress, her neck draped in the few diamond pieces she had not yet pawned. She had convinced Bradley that her diplomatic charm and her status as a premier Atlanta socialite would be the ultimate closing tactic. She truly believed her beauty and her connections could manipulate anyone in a boardroom completely ignorant to the fact that she was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. They stepped out of the private elevator onto the top floor of the Horizon Tech building. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern wealth. Polished black marble, cascading water features, and silent, efficient staff moving like ghosts. Chloe adjusted her designer handbag, looking around with a greedy, approving smile. She leaned into Bradley, whispering that this was exactly the kind of Tier 1 networking they needed to survive. She approached the executive assistant with the practiced, arrogant entitlement she used on waitstaff and valets. "We are here for the 2 o'clock emergency summit with N.A. Sterling," Chloe announced, not bothering to learn the assistant's name. "I am Chloe Vance, and this is my husband Bradley. Please let him know we have a very tight schedule this afternoon, so we would appreciate skipping the usual corporate delays." The assistant, perfectly trained and completely unfazed by my sister's aggressive snobbery, stood up smoothly. "Mr. Sterling is ready for you now. Please follow me." The heavy double doors swung open, revealing an office that dwarfed Bradley's previous venture capital suite. The room was massive, bathed in natural light from the panoramic windows that offered a dominating view of the Atlanta skyline. At the far end of the room sat a massive desk carved from a single piece of petrified wood. Behind it, a high-backed leather executive chair was swiveled completely around facing the windows. Bradley did not wait for an invitation. He practically sprinted toward the desk, sweat already beading on his forehead. Mr. Sterling Bradley started his voice a frantic, high-pitched rush. I cannot thank you enough for taking this meeting. I know my firm's recent market fluctuations have caused some temporary friction between our platforms, but I assure you it is nothing a renewed licensing contract cannot instantly cure. I am prepared to offer you an exclusive, incredibly lucrative partnership. We will double your previous royalty rate. We will give you a seat on the Apex Advisory Board. Just reactivate the algorithm. Please. The entire European portfolio is hanging by a thread. The chair did not move. The silent figure facing the glass remained completely still. Chloe recognized Bradley's desperate tone and immediately stepped forward to salvage their position. She placed a manicured hand on the edge of the desk, leaning forward slightly to showcase her practiced diplomatic smile. She pitched her voice low, coating her words in thick, sugary charm. What my husband means to say, Mr. Sterling, is that we understand the value of deep, mutually beneficial relationships. Chloe paused, letting her words sink into the quiet room. We represent the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's elite. The black upper class in this city has very deep, very powerful roots. We control the charity boards, the political funding, the social currency. If you partner with us, you are not just getting a financial return. You are gaining immediate, unrestricted access to the most exclusive circles in the South. We can make you a king in this city. You scratch our backs and we will elevate you beyond your wildest corporate dreams. I let the silence hang in the air for 5 long, agonizing seconds. I wanted them to feel the absolute peak of their own arrogance before I crushed it. Slowly, the heavy leather chair swiveled around. I was wearing a pristine white tailored suit, my hair flawlessly styled, my posture radiating absolute terrifying control. I rested my elbows on the armrests, interlacing my fingers, and looked directly into my sister's widened eyes. The reaction was instantaneous and physically violent. Bradley stumbled backward, his knees actually buckling beneath him. He grabbed the back of a guest chair just to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpet. His mouth fell open, his eyes bulging as if he were staring at a ghost. Chloe froze completely. Her diplomatic smile melted off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. The blood drained from her cheeks so fast, she looked physically ill. Her manicured hand slipped off the edge of the desk. You, Chloe whispered the word, barely escaping her throat. It cannot be you. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an executioner. Hello, sister, I said softly, my voice echoing in the massive room. Hello, brother-in-law. I must admit, Chloe, your pitch was fascinating, but I do not need you to make me a king in this city. I already own the castle. Bradley began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved as he frantically looked between me and the door, his brain short-circuiting as he tried to process the mathematical impossibility of his situation. You are N.A. Sterling. He gasped, his voice cracking with absolute terror. You wrote the algorithm. You shut off the servers. You did this. You deliberately destroyed my firm. I did not destroy your firm, Bradley, I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. I simply removed the safety net you did not even know you were standing on. You built your entire venture capital empire on my intellectual labor, while constantly reminding me that I was nothing more than an uneducated housewife. You sat in your luxurious living room and mocked my lack of a degree. You convinced my father to gamble his church on a fraudulent shell company because you truly believed you were the smartest man in the room. You dug this grave completely by yourself. I just refused to throw you a rope. Oh. Chloe finally found her voice. Her horror morphed into a desperate, frantic rage. The refined socialite vanished, leaving only a terrified, cornered animal. She slammed both hands onto my desk. You vindictive, psychotic monster! You set us up! You planned this entire thing just to humiliate us. You are going to reactivate that software right now, Nia. You owe this family. You owe our father. You cannot let them take the church. I stood up slowly. The sheer force of my presence made Chloe take an involuntary step backward. I picked up a thick-bound legal document resting on the corner of my desk and tossed it casually toward them. It landed with a heavy smack right in front of Bradley's shaking hands. I owe you absolutely nothing, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy whisper. But I did draft something for you. Since you love exclusive contracts so much, I went ahead and had my legal team prepare your corporate bankruptcy filings. I even paid the filing fee. Sign them, Bradley. Sign away the remnants of your firm hand over the remaining assets to Horizon Tech Valley, and I might consider giving your father 90 days to vacate his church before I tear it down. Chloe let out a sound that was half shriek, half sob. The pristine, untouchable facade she had cultivated for her entire adult life shattered into a million jagged pieces right on my office floor. She didn't try to negotiate. She didn't try to use her precious Atlanta socialite charm. She simply grabbed her designer handbag with trembling, clammy fingers, turned on her heels, and physically ran out of the office. I could hear her frantic, echoing sobs all the way down the corridor until the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung shut behind her. Bradley just stood there, staring blankly at the bankruptcy documents on my desk, as if they were written in a foreign language. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death certificate. Without a single word, he picked up the pen resting beside the file, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grip the gold barrel. He scrawled his signature across the bottom line, effectively signing over the last miserable scraps of his firm to me, and shuffled out of the room like a ghost. I sat back in my leather chair watching the city traffic crawl far below my windows. The absolute silence of my office felt luxurious. But I knew the peace was strictly temporary. Chloe was running straight back to the hive, and the swarm was about to attack. It took exactly 45 minutes. My private cell phone, a number only a select few people possessed, began to vibrate across the petrified wood of my desk. The caller ID flashed with the name I fully expected. It was my father, Pastor Silas, the man who had spent the last decade preaching about forgiveness and grace to thousands while treating his own daughter like a disposable stepping stone. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the absolute desperation radiating through the digital signal before I finally answered. Nia, what in the name of God is going on? His voice boomed through the speaker. It was his signature pulpit voice, the one he used to command submission from his congregation. But today, beneath the manufactured righteous fury, there was a tremor of raw, unfiltered panic. Chloe just burst through the front door screaming that you are the one holding the tech patents. She is hyperventilating on the living room floor, saying you are threatening to demolish the sanctuary. I picked up a silver pen, rolling it casually between my fingers. Good afternoon to you too, Dad. And yes, Chloe's assessment is entirely accurate. Horizon Tech Valley owns the predictive algorithm Bradley so foolishly gambled his entire venture capital fund on, which means I currently hold the keys to his firm and consequently the leverage over your church. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I could hear my mother pacing in the background, her muffled voice shrill and panicked. Then my father's tone shifted. He tried to pivot from anger to an authoritative patriarchal demand. He honestly believed he could still command me. You listen to me, Nia, he growled, the volume rising until the speaker on my phone crackled. You are going to fix this immediately. You are going to reactivate Bradley's software, and you are going to call off whatever attack dogs you have unleashed on the church's collateral. This is your family. I am your father. You are my daughter, and every single thing you have, every dollar of wealth you have stumbled into belongs to this family. You have a responsibility to us. I actually laughed. The sheer blinding audacity of his entitlement was almost breathtaking. Responsibility. I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Where was your sense of responsibility when I came to you begging for help after Derek threw me out? Where was your family loyalty when you and Mom sat at the country club and told your friends I was a mentally unstable disappointment? You threw me to the wolves, Dad. You just didn't expect me to come back leading the pack. Your mother and I were teaching you a lesson in independence, he shouted, completely abandoning his pastoral composure. We were building your character. You owe us your respect. I am the head of this family, and I am ordering you to transfer those assets back to Bradley's firm before Sunday's gala. Do not test me, Nia. I will publicly disown you. I will ruin your reputation in this city. You already disowned me, Dad, I said coldly. And as for my reputation, I am a billionaire with a tech empire. Your reputation is a bankrupt pastor who gambled his congregation's tithes on a phantom tech hub. Go ahead and take the microphone on Sunday. Tell the whole city exactly how you lost their sanctuary. I am sure the federal marshals will enjoy the sermon while they change the locks on your doors. I pressed the red button, cutting off his frantic, sputtering screams. I tossed the phone onto the desk. They were still trapped in the delusion that they held any power over me. They still thought they could bully me into submission. But the Silas family was not a united front. They were a den of vipers, and when a fire breaks out, snakes do not save each other. They scatter. The sun had barely set, painting the Atlanta skyline in bruised shades of purple and gold when my office intercom buzzed. It was my ground floor security desk. Ms. Sterling, the guard, announced, his tone strictly professional. We have a young man down here demanding to see you. He says his name is Trey Silas. He claims it is an extreme family emergency and that he has information you are going to want to buy. A slow, predatory smile spread across my face. The rats were finally abandoning the sinking ship. Send him up, I instructed. 5 minutes later, the heavy double doors to my office swung open. Trey walked in looking nervously over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to be following him. He looked terrible. His designer streetwear was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot, darting around my massive office with a mixture of awe and greedy calculation. He did not look like a loyal son, fighting to save his father's legacy. He looked like an opportunist looking for a payout, Nia Trey said, forcing a casual, friendly tone that sounded completely unnatural coming from his mouth. He walked up to the desk and dropped into one of the leather guest chairs without being asked. Wow, this place is incredible. I always knew you had the brains in the family. I always told Mom and Dad they were underestimating you. I folded my hands on the desk, staring at him blankly. Skip the fake sibling bonding, Trey. Security said you have something to sell. I am a very busy woman. What do you want? Trey swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the polished wood of my desk. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The house is a complete war zone. Dad is frantically burning documents in the fireplace. Mom is packing her jewelry into a safe box. Bradley is completely unresponsive, just staring at the wall in the guest room. The whole empire is dead, Nia. It is over. I am fully aware of the structural collapse of this family, I replied evenly. Tell me something I do not know. Trey licked his dry lips. He looked around the room one more time before fixing his desperate eyes on mine. I know you want to bury him. I know you want Dad to pay for what he did to you. But just foreclosing on the church isn't enough. He will spin it. He will play the victim. He will tell the congregation it was an aggressive corporate takeover by an evil tech firm, and they will probably start a new building fund for him by next month. He will survive it. And you can prevent that, I asked, letting a hint of mild curiosity enter my voice to draw him out. I can give you the smoking gun, Trey said, a greedy, desperate light flashing in his eyes. Dad thinks I am stupid. He thinks I just play video games and spend his money. But I know the combination to the hidden safe behind the bookshelf in his private study. I have been watching him for months. I have the actual ledgers, Nia, the real ones. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The wire transfers moving the congregation's charity donations directly into his personal gambling accounts. The forged tax documents he submitted to the IRS. I have enough hard physical evidence to put him in federal prison for the next 15 years. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms, looking incredibly pleased with his own treacherous ingenuity. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought he was playing a masterstroke. I will give you the flash drive with all the scanned documents, Trey said, his voice dripping with pure greed. I will give you the exact financial trail to destroy him permanently. All I want is $1 million, cash, wired to a secure account I opened yesterday. I just want my cut so I can get out of Atlanta and start over in Los Angeles before the feds raid the estate. $1 million is pocket change for you now, Nia. It is a bargain for the ultimate revenge. I looked at my younger brother, the golden boy, the son who could do no wrong, the boy who had laughed with my mother when Derek threw me out onto the street. He was sitting across from me, casually offering to sell our father's freedom for a fraction of my wealth. It was the ultimate disgusting proof of the Silas family's moral bankruptcy. I reached across the desk and tapped the screen of my smartphone. The digital interface of the voice recording app illuminated the space between us. The timer showed it had been recording for exactly 6 minutes and 42 seconds. Trey's smug smile instantly vanished. His eyes locked onto the glowing red recording icon, and his face drained of color. "What are you doing?" he stammered, gripping the armrests of his chair. "Did you just record me?" I picked up the phone, stopping the recording and saving the file to a secure cloud server with a single swipe of my finger. "You are incredibly predictable, Trey," I said, my voice as cold as absolute zero. "You really thought you could walk into my office, leverage our father's criminal activity, and walk out a millionaire. You thought you were smart enough to play both sides of the board." Trey stood up, panic completely overtaking his features. "Delete that, Nia. You cannot use that. I came here to help you. I am offering you the evidence you need." I stood up, matching his panic with absolute, unyielding authority. I leaned across the desk, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "Keep your cheap, pathetic loyalty, Trey." I told him, each word a hammer blow. "I do not need your stolen flash drives. I do not need you to betray him, because I do not just want to put him in prison. I want to own the very ground he stands on. And as of this morning, I have already bought the church's debt directly from Bradley's liquidated fund. The Silas empire does not belong to the bank, it belongs to me. Now get out of my building before I send this recording directly to Dad. Let him hear exactly how much his golden boy thinks his freedom is worth." Trey practically sprinted out of the Horizon Tech building, his expensive sneakers sliding frantically on the polished marble floors as he fled. I watched his retreating figure from the towering glass windows of my office, completely unbothered by his cowardly exit. The rats were actively turning on each other, desperately trying to save their own skin. But the trap had already been permanently sealed. Chloe and Bradley had fled this very same office the day prior in absolute soul-crushing terror. I had forced Bradley to sign the corporate bankruptcy and surrender documents under the immediate threat of federal wire fraud charges regarding his fake Austin tech hub. Embedded deep within that thick stack of legal paperwork was an ironclad, severely punitive non-disclosure agreement. If either Bradley or Chloe breathed a single word about my true identity, my net worth, or my total ownership of Horizon Tech Valley, I would hand the explosive audio recording of Trey's blackmail attempt, along with Bradley's fraudulent financial ledgers, directly to the FBI. They were legally gagged and entirely paralyzed by fear. So when they had returned to the Buckhead estate, they kept their mouths tightly shut. They let my parents drown in their own blissful ignorance. The very next morning, a bonded courier delivered a heavy cream-colored envelope to the Silas family estate. Pastor Silas sat in his ruined study, staring blankly at the wall, surrounded by the physical wreckage of his impending foreclosure. Then Cecilia walked in, tearing open the certified letter bearing the seal of an elite offshore banking institution. Her eyes quickly scanned the legal jargon. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. She read the document a second time. She read it a third time, her hands beginning to shake with an entirely new emotion. The debt was cleared. The multi-million-dollar church mortgage, the estate loans, Bradley's toxic liens. All of it had been purchased in a single massive clean cash transaction by an anonymous private equity firm. The document formally stated that the new undisclosed owner required a formal meeting to discuss the future management of the physical assets. They did not suspect me. They did not suspect the daughter they had discarded. They did not suspect the woman they had thrown out into the freezing rain. Instead, their legendary blind arrogance roared back to vivid life. They convinced themselves that God had provided a miracle, They convinced themselves that the Silas legacy was simply too important, too divinely protected to fail. They genuinely believed that some devout, ultra-wealthy benefactor from their elite social circles had recognized their supreme prestige and had stepped in to protect their holy institution from ruin. Cecilia did what she always did when she felt powerful. She threw a party. Not just a standard gathering, but the most extravagant, opulent charity gala the Atlanta social season had witnessed in a decade. It was to be held at the Grand Crystal Ballroom of the church's massive community center, a space they now mistakenly believed was safe from the auction block. My mother completely drained her last remaining line of personal credit to overnight gold-foiled hand-calligraphed invitations to every politician, every real estate mogul, and every megachurch pastor in the state of Georgia. She wanted a massive captive audience to witness her ultimate triumph. She wanted an audience to welcome their mysterious billionaire savior. And most importantly, she wanted an audience to watch me fail. The courier arrived at my penthouse 3 days before the gala. My private security team scanned the package for threats and handed it directly to me in my home office. It was not a gold-foiled invitation. It was a standard cheap catering contract printed on basic copy paper. Pinned securely to the front was a handwritten note on Cecilia's personal embossed stationery. The ink was sharp, pressing deeply into the paper. It read, "Since you are no longer part of this family's blessings, and since we know your lucky financial settlement is likely running dry by now, we thought you could use the hourly wage. Report to the service entrance at 6 o'clock sharp. Wear a black uniform. Serve the appetizers quietly. Do not embarrass us in front of our Savior." I stared at the cheap catering contract. I stared at the vicious cursive handwriting of the woman who gave birth to me. I stared at the utter magnificent delusion dripping from every single word. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not throw the degrading paper into the trash. I carefully folded it and placed it inside my safe. I framed it in my mind as the absolute final nail in her social coffin. She wanted me carrying a tray. She wanted me serving champagne to the people who used to be my peers. She wanted to break me down to the exact subservient level she truly believed I belonged on. The evening of the gala arrived. The air in Atlanta was thick, humid, and electric with anticipation. I stood in the center of my massive walk-in closet, surrounded by racks of muted silk, quiet cashmere, and understated diamonds. But tonight was not about blending in. Tonight was not about the subtle whispers of stealth wealth. Tonight was about absolute, undeniable, deafening domination. I bypassed the conservative business attire. I selected a custom vintage Schiaparelli haute couture gown that I had acquired at a private auction in Paris. It was red. It was the red of a blaring stop sign. It was the red of a fresh, deep wound. It was the red of pure, unfiltered vengeance. The heavy silk fabric cascaded down my frame, hugging every curve perfectly before pooling at my feet like liquid fire. It was a dress designed to silence a room the second the wearer walked through the door. I paired it with a spectacular heavy vintage diamond choker that cost significantly more than Bradley's entire liquidated venture capital firm. I sat down at my brightly lit vanity mirror. I picked up a heavy gold tube of lipstick. It was red. I painted my lips slowly. I painted them meticulously. I painted over the terrified girl who used to beg for their parental love. I painted over the broken wife who used to shrink under Derek's daily crushing insults. I painted over the discarded daughter who was never ever good enough for the Silas name. I looked at my reflection in the polished glass. The woman staring back was not a victim. The woman staring back was a titan. The woman staring back legally owned the very ground they walked on. The woman staring back was the exact anonymous billionaire they were throwing this lavish, desperate party to impress. My lead security director, a towering former military operative named Vance, tapped respectfully on the open bedroom door. "The motorcade is ready, Mrs. Sterling. We have fully secured the perimeter of the community center. The press is already gathered at the front entrance." I stood up, smoothing the crimson silk of my gown. I picked up a small, sleek black crocodile clutch. Inside it, resting perfectly flat, were the original freshly notarized property deeds to the Silas Buckhead estate and the main church sanctuary. "It is time to go, Vance," I said, my voice echoing smoothly and coldly in the quiet luxury of the penthouse. My mother specifically requested a server for her party. I suppose it is finally time to show them exactly who is serving the main course tonight. The drive from my downtown penthouse to the church's community center took exactly 22 minutes. I sat in the spacious rear cabin of my armored Maybach, staring out at the passing city lights. The streets of Atlanta were completely unaware of the absolute seismic shift that was about to occur within its most elite social circles. Vance sat in the front passenger seat, his earpiece glowing faintly in the dim light, coordinating the arrival with my legal team, who were traveling in the two black SUVs trailing directly behind us. When my motorcade pulled up to the venue, the sheer scale of my mother's delusion was on full display. Searchlights swept across the night sky. Red velvet ropes held back a throng of curious onlookers, while a swarm of local media and society photographers clustered near the entrance. Valets were rushing to park a continuous stream of Bentleys, Porsches, and custom luxury sedans. My mother had managed to gather the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's high society. The mayor, the governor, prominent judges, and rival mega-church pastors were all walking up the grand staircase. Cecilia had spent every last dime of her remaining credit to host a party, celebrating a financial miracle she did not understand, completely convinced that a benevolent, anonymous savior was coming to rescue her perfect image. I waited in the car until the grand ballroom was at maximum capacity. Inside the crystal ballroom was a masterclass in desperate opulence. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from towering silver centerpieces. A live string quartet played softly in the corner. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms circulated with trays of vintage champagne and beluga caviar. Through the secure feed on Vance's tablet, I watched the live security footage of the interior. Up on the raised, brilliantly lit dais at the far end of the room, my family stood holding court. Pastor Silas wore a custom velvet tuxedo jacket, projecting the practiced image of a humble servant blessed by divine favor. He was shaking hands with a state senator, smiling broadly. Beside him, Cecilia was draped in a massive, glittering blue necklace. I almost laughed out loud. It was a cheap synthetic replica of the Cartier sapphire piece I had bought and melted down days ago. She was still trying to fake a reality that no longer existed. Chloe and Bradley stood slightly behind my parents. They looked entirely different from the rest of the room. While everyone else was laughing and celebrating, my sister and her husband looked like hostages facing a firing squad. Bradley was sweating profusely, his face a sickly gray color, his eyes darting toward the exit every few seconds. Chloe was clutching a glass of water, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. They knew exactly who owned the church's debt. They knew exactly who the anonymous billionaire was. But the ruthless ironclad non-disclosure agreement they had signed under the threat of federal wire fraud charges kept their mouths tightly shut. They were legally paralyzed, forced to stand on that stage and watch their parents march happily toward a slaughterhouse. I watched the screen as my mother stopped a passing catering manager. She pointed sharply toward the service doors, her lips pulled into a tight, vicious line. She was looking for me. She was scanning the room for the disgraced failure of a daughter she had ordered to report to the kitchen. She desperately wanted the immediate gratification of seeing me carrying a tray of appetizers serving the very people who used to attend our family dinners. She needed to see me broken and humiliated in front of her entire social circle to validate her own superiority. It was time. I gave Vance a single nod. He stepped out of the Maybach and opened my door. The humid Atlanta air hit me as I stepped out onto the pavement. The heavy crimson silk of my vintage Schiaparelli gown pooled beautifully around my heels. The massive diamond choker resting against my collarbone caught the flash of a nearby camera, sending fractured rainbows of light across the concrete. My security detail formed a tight, impenetrable wedge around me as we walked past the velvet ropes. The photographers outside, assuming I was a visiting celebrity or a foreign dignitary, immediately began snapping photos, shouting questions I completely ignored. We bypassed the standard reception line and walked directly toward the heavy carved oak doors of the main ballroom. Vance pushed the doors open. They did not just swing, they crashed backward against the walls with a thunderous boom that immediately silenced the entire room. The string quartet faltered. The music ground to a screeching, dissonant halt as cellos and violins dragged across their strings. The low hum of elite conversation evaporated into a dead, heavy silence. Every single head in the massive ballroom turned toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold. I did not walk in through the service entrance holding a tray of cheap appetizers. I walked into the crystal ballroom, flanked by towering armed security operatives and a team of high-powered corporate attorneys. The red gown commanded the space like a blazing siren. The local press, invited by my mother to document the arrival of their mysterious savior, immediately pivoted. Recognizing the raw projection of absolute institutional power, they aimed their massive camera lenses directly at me. Flashbulbs erupted like a violent lightning storm, illuminating the room in rapid, blinding bursts of white light. The crowd of politicians and socialites instinctively parted, stepping back to create a wide, unobstructed path down the center of the ballroom, leading directly to the stage. Whispers rippled through the elite crowd as they tried to comprehend the spectacular disruption. On the stage, the illusion completely shattered. Chloe let out a muffled, terrified whimper and physically ducked behind Bradley. Bradley squeezed his eyes shut, looking as if he was praying for the polished floor to swallow him whole. Cecilia dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the stage floor, the sound sharp and violent in the frozen room. Her eyes bulged, absorbing the red haute couture gown, the blinding diamonds, and the sheer lethal authority of my entrance. Her brain could not bridge the gap between the daughter she had ordered to wear a uniform and the titan currently commanding the room. But my father could not process the reality of the situation. His patriarchal ego blinded him to everything except his own manufactured authority. He did not see a billionaire entering her property. He saw his rebellious, disobedient daughter making a spectacle and threatening his carefully curated pious image. His face flushed a dark, mottled crimson. He abandoned his post beside the state senator, marching down the carpeted steps of the dais with aggressive, heavy strides. He pushed his way through the parted crowd, his face twisted in absolute fury. He marched straight toward me, completely ignoring the massive security guards who immediately tensed on either side of me. I raised a single finger, signaling Vance to stand down. I wanted my father to reach me. He intercepted me halfway down the center aisle. The cameras continued to flash wildly, capturing his furious scowl and my perfect icy calm. He leaned in close, his voice a harsh, venomous hiss meant only for my ears, desperate to maintain the illusion of control. "What do you think you are doing?" Pastor Silas demanded, his hand shooting out to grab my arm in a bruising grip. "Where did you get that outfit? You are making a mockery of this family. I told you to report to the service entrance. Go to the kitchen right now and put on your uniform. Get out the back door immediately before the billionaire arrives." I did not step back. I did not lower my gaze. I looked at his sweaty, furious face, then down at the hand gripping my arm. I flicked my wrist, slapping his hand away with a sharp, forceful strike. The sound echoed loudly in the silent ballroom, causing several guests to gasp in shock. I looked directly into his terrified, angry eyes, my red lips curving into a cold, devastating smile. "The billionaire is already here, Pastor." My father's jaw slackened, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of complete and utter shock. The righteous fury that had burned in his eyes just a second prior dissolved into a vacant, uncomprehending stare. He looked at the heavy red silk of my vintage gown, at the spectacular diamonds resting against my collarbone, and finally, at the imposing ring of heavily armed security operatives flanking my every move. His mind simply refused to process the mathematics of the situation. He had spent his entire life viewing me as a stepping stone, a background character in his grand play, and his ego could not compute that the daughter he had discarded was the one holding the deed to his sanctuary. I did not give him the time to recover or formulate another demand. I simply stepped around him, leaving the great Pastor Silas frozen and speechless in the center aisle, and glided up the carpeted steps of the main dais. The crowd parted for me automatically, their eyes tracking the movement of my dress like moths drawn to an open flame. The microphone stood waiting on a crystal podium at the center of the stage, positioned perfectly for the evening's guest of honor. I wrapped my fingers around the sleek metal stand and pulled it toward me. A brief, sharp whine of audio feedback echoed through the ballroom's massive sound system, snapping the elite crowd out of their collective trance. Chloe broke first. The sheer paralyzing terror of impending exposure shattered whatever refined social restraint she had left. She realized exactly what I was about to do, and the polished Atlanta socialite vanished, replaced by a desperate, frantic animal. She lunged across the stage, her expensive designer heels sinking dangerously into the thick carpet as she threw her entire body weight toward the podium. Her hands clawed frantically at the air, desperate to rip the microphone from my grip before I could utter a single syllable. "Are you crazy?" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill, breathless, and echoing loudly without any need for amplification. "You are destroying the family's honor. Shut your mouth and get off this stage right now." I did not even flinch. I did not waste a single drop of sweat on her pathetic outburst. I simply shifted my weight smoothly, stepping out of her chaotic trajectory. Chloe stumbled forward, her manicured hands grasping empty air, nearly falling completely off the edge of the raised dais. Before she could regain her balance and mount a second attack, Vance stepped forward. My lead security operative effortlessly restrained her by the shoulders, pinning her arms to her sides. He held her firmly in place as she thrashed and kicked her perfect facade, melting into ugly feral desperation right in front of the flashing cameras. I turned my attention back to the sea of faces. The politicians, the wealthy socialites, and most importantly, the senior members of my father's congregation who had been invited here to witness this supposed divine miracle. I raised my free hand and gave a sharp, precise nod to the lead attorney standing at the base of the stage. Instantly, the massive digital projection screen behind the dais flickered to life. The church's giant golden cross logo, which had been rotating peacefully on the screen all evening, vanished. In its place, a high-resolution scan of a heavily redacted, incredibly dense legal contract materialized. The text was magnified so dramatically that every single person in the grand ballroom, all the way to the back exit doors, could easily read the bold, undeniable print. "Good evening, Atlanta," I said, my voice echoing evenly and powerfully across the vast, suddenly silent room. "You were invited here tonight to celebrate a financial miracle. You were told that an anonymous benevolent benefactor stepped in at the final hour to save the Silas estate and the church sanctuary from an aggressive corporate foreclosure. You were told to rejoice in my father's divine favor. But miracles require truth, and this family has been dealing exclusively in poison and lies." I pointed toward the glowing screen behind me. My legal team tapped a keyboard and the projected image shifted. A complex, undeniable series of bank transfer records, routing numbers, and offshore account ledgers flooded the screen, highlighted in bright, condemning red ink. "What you are looking at is the true legacy of Bradley Vance." I continued, letting the cold, hard facts slice through the suffocating silence of the room. My esteemed brother-in-law did not just lose venture capital in a bad market. He did not simply make a few poor business decisions. He actively, intentionally stole from the people standing in this very room. Bradley used the retirement funds, the hard-earned pensions, and the fragile life savings of the senior congregation members to collateralize his fraudulent tech investments. He took the money you trusted to this holy institution, the money you placed in my father's hands, and he funneled it directly into illegal offshore gambling syndicates to cover his own massive debts. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the audience. An older woman in the second row, a parishioner I recognized from my childhood, pressed her trembling hands to her mouth, her face draining of color. Angry, confused murmurs began to ignite across the ballroom, rising in volume and intensity as people squinted to read their own names and stolen account numbers flashing on the massive screen. Bradley was completely paralyzed. He stood frozen near the edge of the stage, his chest heaving irregularly, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He looked like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming freight train, entirely unable to move or speak as his entire life burned down around him. But Bradley did not act alone, I announced, my voice cutting sharply through the rising, furious clamor of the crowd. The screen shifted again. This time, it displayed a series of official medical competency certificates and legal power of attorney documents. I turned slowly, looking directly at my sister, who was still struggling weakly against Vance's unyielding grip. Her face had turned an absolute ghastly white, the fight drained completely out of her muscles. Chloe, the brilliant, highly respected doctor of this family, played a vital criminal role in this enterprise, I stated, ensuring my voice carried over the growing outrage of the audience. She used her esteemed medical credentials and her pristine, untouchable social reputation to sign falsified psychological evaluations. She visited your homes, pretended to care for your health, and then declared perfectly healthy elderly parishioners mentally unfit. She did this so Bradley could legally assume power of attorney over their financial estates. Chloe forged the medical certificates that allowed her husband to drain your life savings without raising a single red flag with the bank. She traded your security for her designer dresses. The ballroom erupted. The polite elite gathering instantly descended into absolute furious chaos. Outrage and horror exploded from the crowd. People were shouting, pointing accusing fingers at the stage, demanding answers and demanding blood. The flashing cameras of the local press went into an absolute frenzy, capturing the catastrophic, highly public destruction of the Silas family empire in high definition. My mother was openly weeping near the front row, clutching her cheap replica necklace as her social standing evaporated into dust right before her eyes. My father remained rooted to the spot in the aisle, staring at the screen with a look of profound, inescapable damnation. The sheer crushing weight of the public exposure finally broke Bradley. The paralysis holding him hostage dissolved into pure, blind, adrenaline-fueled panic. He spun around, shoving his way violently past a terrified catering waiter, sending a silver tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor. He made a mad, frantic dash for the side exit of the ballroom, sprinting toward the heavy emergency doors, desperate to escape the flashing cameras and the roaring, furious crowd closing in around the stage. But the trap had already been fully set, and the perimeter was completely sealed. The moment Bradley threw his weight against the exit doors and pushed them open, the harsh, blinding glare of tactical flashlights hit him squarely in the face. A specialized team of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI, had already secured the hallway. They were waiting exactly where my legal team had instructed them to be. I watched clearly through the open doorway as Bradley was swiftly tackled and slammed against the brick wall of the corridor. The sharp metallic click of heavy handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed perfectly over the shouting crowd inside the ballroom. Chloe saw it happen. She watched the federal agents drag her husband away in chains through the open doors. She realized with absolute terrifying clarity that the stolen money was gone, her carefully curated reputation was permanently destroyed, and her prestigious medical license was about to be replaced by a lengthy federal prison sentence. Her legs simply gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood of the stage, her beautiful, expensive designer gown pooling around her as she broke into loud, hysterical, ragged sobs. The untouchable golden child of the Silas family was finally permanently broken. The sound of Chloe weeping was the only noise in the crystal ballroom for a long, agonizing moment. The sheer, visceral reality of her collapse seemed to freeze the oxygen in the room. Then the spell broke. The frantic, buzzing whispers of Atlanta's most powerful socialites resumed, sharp and stinging like a swarm of angry hornets. They were pointing, staring, and rapidly typing on their phones, broadcasting the catastrophic downfall of the Silas family to the rest of the world. Cecilia Silas could not handle the whispers. She had spent her entire adult life feeding on the envy and admiration of the people in this room. To have them witness her pristine, untouchable world unraveling in real time was a fate worse than death. Her mind simply snapped. She could not process the sight of her perfect daughter crumpled on the stage like discarded trash, or her son-in-law being hauled away in federal handcuffs. She needed a target. She needed someone to blame for the sudden violent destruction of her reality. She turned her furious, tear-streaked face toward me. "You are a demon!" my mother shrieked. her voice cracking with raw, unhinged hysteria. She lunged forward, her hands balled into tight fists, completely abandoning the refined, elegant persona she had cultivated for decades. She looked ready to physically tear the vintage silk off my body. My security detail instantly shifted their hands, moving smoothly toward their holsters, but I raised my chin, silently ordering them to hold their ground. Let her speak. Let the entire city witness exactly who she was. "You psychotic, vindictive demon!" Cecilia screamed, stopping just inches from my security line. "You planned this entire spectacle just to humiliate us. You set Bradley up. You ruined your sister. You destroyed her life because you have always been jealous of her. You are no daughter of mine. You hear me? You are nothing to this family. You are a bitter, jealous failure." I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me. Her face was contorted into an ugly, hateful mask, her heavy makeup running down her cheeks in dark, muddy streaks. She was standing in the middle of a ballroom funded by stolen retirement money, defending a daughter who had forged medical documents to rob the elderly, and yet she still possessed the blinding arrogance to call me a failure. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The microphone on the podium amplified my calm, icy tone, projecting it effortlessly over her frantic screaming. "You love to talk about family loyalty, Mother," I said, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You love to preach about the sacred bond of the Silas name, and how I am the stain that tarnished it. But where exactly is the rest of your perfect family tonight? Where is your golden boy while you stand here defending a sinking ship?" Cecilia blinked, her rant momentarily derailed by the question. She looked around the chaotic ballroom, her eyes darting frantically through the crowd. Trey was nowhere to be found. He had not attended the gala. He had been conspicuously absent all evening, a fact my mother had previously excused as a minor scheduling conflict. "He is not here to defend you, Mother," I continued, reaching into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulling out my smartphone. "Because your precious, brilliant son already saw the writing on the wall. He knew the federal raid was coming. And instead of warning you, instead of standing by the parents who spoiled him rotten his entire life, he decided to secure his own exit strategy." I tapped the screen of my phone and held it directly against the microphone. The audio file was crystal clear. The acoustics of the grand ballroom captured every single syllable of Trey's desperate, greedy voice, broadcasting his betrayal to the hundreds of elite guests staring up at the stage in morbid fascination. "The house is a complete war zone," Trey's recorded voice echoed through the massive speakers. "Dad is frantically burning documents in the fireplace. Mom is packing her jewelry into a safe box." Cecilia gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Pastor Silas, who had been standing frozen in the center aisle, suddenly looked incredibly ill. "I know the combination to the hidden safe behind the bookshelf in his private study," the recording continued, laying bare the absolute rotten core of the Silas family. "I have the actual ledgers, Nia. The real ones. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The wire transfers moving the congregation's charity donations directly into his personal gambling accounts. I have enough hard physical evidence to put him in federal prison for the next 15 years. I will give you the flash drive. All I want is $1 million. Cash. I just want my cut so I can get out of Atlanta and start over in Los Angeles before the feds raid the estate." I pulled the phone away from the microphone and tapped the screen, cutting off the audio. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total annihilation. The crowd of politicians, judges, and rival pastors stared at my parents with open, undisguised disgust. The facade was completely gone. There was no denying the evidence. Their own son had just confessed their crimes to a room full of witnesses. Cecilia's knees buckled. She staggered backward, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. Her golden boy, the son she had protected and elevated above all others, had tried to sell them to the highest bidder for a plane ticket to California. She looked at my father, her eyes wide with a terror that finally matched the severity of their situation. I opened my sleek black crocodile clutch. I reached inside and pulled out the heavy notarized stack of legal documents I had brought with me. The thick parchment paper felt incredibly satisfying against my fingertips. I stepped out from behind the podium, walking right up to the edge of the raised dais, looking directly down at my mother. "I did not ruin anyone, Mother," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. The deep, festering rot of this family ruined itself. You dug your own graves with your greed, your arrogance, and your endless suffocating lies. You spent my entire life calling me a dropout. You called me a stain on your perfect legacy. You told your friends I was a failure who would never amount to anything. I raised the legal documents high in the air, ensuring the flashing cameras of the local press captured the unmistakable seals and signatures of the real estate transfers. But this stain just signed the check to buy out the entire debt of this community center, the main church sanctuary, and the Buckhead estate you are currently living in. I declared the power of my words, striking the final fatal blow to their empire. Horizon Tech Valley owns it all. You do not have an anonymous billionaire savior coming to rescue you, mother. You are looking at her, and as the sole owner of these properties, I am formally terminating your access. You have absolutely nothing left. Cecilia could not process the reality of my words. She simply collapsed onto the floor, curling in on herself, her loud, ragged sobbing joining the pathetic sounds of my sister crying on the stage behind me. They were broken, stripped of their wealth, their status, and their pride. But the true victory was not watching my mother cry. I looked past her toward the center aisle. Pastor Silas, the mighty head of the family, the man who had commanded thousands with his booming voice and demanded absolute submission from his daughters, was stumbling toward the stage. His velvet tuxedo jacket looked entirely out of place on his defeated, shaking frame. The fierce, righteous arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely extinguished. He reached the base of the dais. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with an absolute crushing despair. He realized that the federal agents who had just arrested his son-in-law would undoubtedly be coming for him next. He realized that his offshore accounts, his forged ledgers, and his stolen charity funds were fully exposed. He realized that the daughter he had cast out was the only person on earth who held the power to save him from total annihilation. Slowly, agonizingly, the great Pastor Silas bent his knees. The crowd watched in stunned, breathless disbelief as the most powerful religious figure in Atlanta descended to the floor. He dropped entirely to his knees, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the hardwood. He reached out with trembling, desperate hands, his fingers grasping tightly onto the heavy red silk hem of my vintage Schiaparelli gown. He clung to the fabric as if he were drowning in a violent storm, and I was his only lifeline. "Please, Nia," he begged, his voice a broken, raspy whisper that carried clearly in the silent ballroom. Tears streamed openly down his weathered face, dripping onto his starched white collar. "Please, do not take my church." I stared down at the top of my father's perfectly groomed head. His hands, the same hands that used to pound the pulpit in righteous fury, were trembling violently as they gripped the hem of my gown. I waited for the guilt. I waited for the familiar, deeply ingrained instinct to comfort him, to shrink myself down, to make his ego feel big again. But there was absolutely nothing. No tears blurred my vision. No sudden wave of daughterly pity softened my heart. I felt only a vast glacial emptiness, and beneath it the sweet, intoxicating hum of total satisfaction. To my left, Cecilia was a crumpled, sobbing mess on the floor, her carefully constructed high society facade entirely melted away. Behind me on the stage, Chloe was hyperventilating, watching through the exit doors as the federal agents loaded her husband into the back of a black SUV. The elite congregation, the politicians, the judges, they all stood frozen in morbid silence, watching the mighty Silas family disintegrate into ash. There was just one piece missing. I looked up and gave Vance a sharp two-finger gesture. Vance tapped his earpiece and spoke a single quiet command. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open again. Two of my security operatives marched in, dragging a thrashing, terrified figure between them. It was Trey. They had intercepted my dear brother trying to slip out through the kitchen loading dock with a duffel bag full of stolen cash and my mother's jewelry. They dragged him all the way down the center aisle and threw him onto the floor right next to my kneeling father. Trey scrambled backward, looking up at me with wide, panicked eyes, his breathing shallow and rapid. Now the family was complete. I raised my hand again. This time, 4 massive operatives stepped forward from the shadows of the room. They were not carrying legal briefcases or velvet boxes. They were carrying cheap, heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. They walked in perfect synchronization down the aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. When they reached the base of the dais, they swung their arms and tossed the bags onto the polished hardwood. The bags landed with a dull, heavy plastic thud right in front of my father, my mother, and Trey. The crowd murmured in confusion, staring at the garbage bags contrasting sharply against the opulent floral arrangements and crystal decor. But my parents understood immediately. My father released my dress as if the fabric had suddenly caught fire. He stared at the black plastic, all the remaining color draining from his face until he looked like a corpse. My mother choked on a sob, her eyes wide with a sudden recognized horror. Trey shrank away from the bags, pulling his knees to his chest. I leaned into the microphone. 12 months ago, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch that forced every single person in the room to hold their breath to listen. 12 months ago, on a freezing torrential Tuesday night, I stood on the front porch of your magnificent Buckhead estate. I was holding my 3 young children. They were shivering, crying, and completely terrified of the dark. I paused, letting the reality of the image sink into the minds of the wealthy congregation members who had spent years worshiping these people. I came to you for shelter. I continued, my voice steady, betraying none of the old pain. I came to you because my husband, the incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful man you so desperately wanted to impress, had been cheating on me for years and had finally locked us out. I came to my parents for protection. But you did not see a daughter in pain. You saw a social liability. You looked at my cheating, abusive ex-husband, and you looked at his massive bank accounts, his political connections, and his generous donations to your church. And you made your choice. You decided that protecting your public image and maintaining his financial favor was far more important than protecting your own flesh and blood. My father bowed his head, unable to meet my gaze. My mother buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly, but I did not stop. I wanted every single one of their high society friends to hear the truth. You looked me in the eye. I said, the memory flashing vividly in my mind, and you told me I was an embarrassment. You told me I was a failure for not keeping my marriage together. You told me I was a stain on the Immaculate Silas legacy. And then you threw your own daughter and your 3 young grandchildren out into the freezing rain. You did not even let us step inside to pack our clothes. You handed me exactly 1 cheap black plastic trash bag with a few old coats, slammed your heavy oak door in our faces, and left us to freeze in the driveway. A collective murmur of disgust swept through the ballroom. The state senator, who had been shaking my father's hand earlier, shook his head in absolute revulsion and turned his back to the stage. The illusion of the holy, loving Silas family was entirely dead. I stepped out from behind the crystal podium. I walked right to the edge of the stage, towering over the 3 pathetic figures cowering on the floor. I did not ruin anyone tonight, I stated, my voice ringing with lethal authority. The deep, festering rot of this family ruined itself. You dug your own graves with your greed, your arrogance, and your endless, suffocating lies. You spent my entire life calling me a dropout. You called me a stain. But it was exactly this stain that just signed the check to buy out the entire debt of this community center, the main church sanctuary, and the very mansion you sleep in. I reached out and tapped the silver grill of the microphone with my fingernail. The sharp metallic thumps echoed like gunshots through the silent ballroom. Now the wheel has turned, I announced, and I am returning the favor. I looked directly down into my father's terrified, bloodshot eyes, then at my mother, and finally at Trey. Dad, Mom, and Trey, you have exactly 1 hour to take these trash bags pack, whatever pathetic scraps you can fit inside them, and get out of my mansion. If you are still on my property in 61 minutes, I will have my security team physically drag you out to the curb, and I will personally call the police to have you arrested for criminal trespassing. The clock starts now. I looked down at the man who had demanded my absolute obedience and submission for my entire life. Pastor Silas, the mighty, untouchable patriarch, was reduced to a trembling, pathetic figure, kneeling on the polished hardwood, his knuckles white, as he clung desperately to the hem of my vintage silk gown. To my left, my mother Cecilia was a crumpled, sobbing mess, her carefully constructed high society facade entirely melted away into a puddle of ruined makeup and ruined pride. In the background, the harsh metallic snap of handcuffs echoed one final time as the federal agents aggressively hauled my sister Chloe through the side exit, her hysterical screams fading into the distance. I waited for the guilt. I waited for the familiar, deeply ingrained instinct to comfort my parents, to shrink myself down to make their egos feel big again. I searched my soul for a single drop of pity, a shred of the desperate daughter who used to crave their blessing and affection. There was absolutely nothing. No tears blurred my vision. No sudden wave of remorse softened my heart. I felt only a vast, magnificent emptiness. It was a cold, pure, and deeply satisfying void, where years of toxic manipulation, gaslighting, and agonizing pain had finally been surgically excised. I did not offer my father a hand. I did not offer him a prayer. I simply raised my hand and gave a sharp, precise wave to my security detail stationed at the edge of the stage. Four towering, heavily muscled operatives immediately detached themselves from the perimeter line. They marched in perfect, intimidating synchronization up the carpeted steps of the dais. They were not carrying legal briefcases, and they were not carrying velvet boxes. Each operative was holding a large, heavy-duty black plastic trash bag. They reached the center of the stage and in unison swung their arms, throwing the bags violently onto the floor. The heavy plastic landed with a dull, echoing thud right in front of my father's trembling knees, stopping just inches from where my mother and Trey were cowering. The harsh, ugly black plastic contrasted violently with the opulent white orchids and sparkling crystal centerpieces of the ballroom. My father released my dress as if the fabric had suddenly caught fire. He stared at the black plastic bags, the last remaining drops of color completely draining from his face. My mother choked on a ragged sob, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying recognition. Trey shrank backward, pulling his knees tightly to his chest, realizing exactly what those bags symbolized. 12 months ago, I said, leaning closely into the microphone, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch that forced every single person in the massive room to hold their breath to listen. 12 months ago, you threw me and your 3 young grandchildren out into the street in the middle of a freezing torrential rainstorm. You cast us out into the dark with exactly one of these cheap trash bags to hold our entire lives. And you did it simply because you were terrified of offending a cheating, abusive son-in-law who held the keys to your social status. I paused, letting the brutal, undeniable reality of the image sink into the minds of the wealthy congregation members who had spent years worshiping and funding these people. I reached out and tapped the silver grill of the microphone with my manicured fingernail. The sharp metallic thumps echoed like 3 distinct gunshots through the paralyzed ballroom. Now I am returning the favor, I announced, my voice ringing out with lethal, absolute authority. Mom, Dad, and Trey, you have exactly 1 hour to take these trash bags, pack whatever pathetic scraps you can fit inside them, and get out of my mansion. If you are still on my property in 61 minutes, I will have my security team physically drag you out to the curb, and I will personally call the Atlanta police to have you arrested for criminal trespassing. The clock starts right now. I stepped back from the podium. The silence that followed was absolute, but it only lasted for a few seconds. The elite crowd of politicians, judges, and rival megachurch pastors did not rush to defend the Silas family. They did not shout in outrage at my demands. Instead, a collective physical recoil rippled through the massive room. The wealthy dowagers, the socialites who had feasted on my mother's gossip, raised their chins and deliberately averted their eyes. The state senator sharply signaled his aides and turned his back squarely on the stage. The whispers began. They were sharp, venomous, and completely merciless. The elite circles of Atlanta were instantly and permanently excommunicating the Silas family. The guests began to physically turn their backs on the stage, pulling away from my parents as if they were infected with a highly contagious lethal disease. The untouchable Silas empire was officially dead, and the vultures were already picking the bones clean. I did not wait to watch them scramble for the trash bags. The execution was complete. I gave Vance a single nod. The security operatives instantly fell into a tight, impenetrable diamond formation around me. I stepped off the raised dais, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the polished hardwood. As I approached the center aisle, the crowd did not just part, they actively fractured. The wealthy and powerful practically climbed over one another to get out of my way, pressing themselves against the linen-draped tables to ensure I had a wide, completely unobstructed path. Eyes that had once looked right through me now lowered in absolute deference or stared in wide, unfiltered awe. I did not acknowledge a single one of them. I kept my gaze fixed firmly straight ahead. With every step I took toward the exit, the heavy, suffocating weight of my past dissolved. The terrified, shivering girl who had stood on that freezing porch a year ago was completely gone, replaced entirely by the Titan walking in her ashes. Vance reached the back of the ballroom and pushed the massive carved oak double doors open. A brilliant, blinding flood of pure light spilled into the dim, chaotic ballroom. The local press, having been corralled into the grand foyer, erupted into a massive storm of camera flashes, creating a wall of brilliant white light that looked like the breaking dawn of a new sun. I walked straight through the blinding flashes, completely unfazed, my head held high, the magnificent diamond choker catching the brilliant light and scattering it across the high vaulted ceilings of the venue. I walked out of the community center and descended the grand exterior staircase. The cool, crisp night air hit my face, smelling beautifully of rain and absolute freedom. At the base of the stone steps, my armored Maybach sat idling silently at the curb. Vance moved ahead of me, pulling open the heavy reinforced rear door of the luxury sedan. I stepped out of the blinding glare of the cameras and looked into the spacious, warmly lit rear cabin of the vehicle. My 3 children were sitting safely in the plush leather seats. They were wearing comfortable pajamas wrapped in soft, heated cashmere blankets. My youngest daughter was fast asleep, her head resting gently against her older brother's shoulder. My eldest son looked up as I approached, his eyes bright and completely devoid of the terror that had consumed them a year ago. They were safe. They were warm. They were protected by a fortress of wealth and power that no one could ever breach again. I climbed into the back of the Maybach, the heavy door thudding shut behind me, instantly silencing the chaotic noise of the world outside. I settled into the luxurious leather, pulling my sleeping daughter into my lap. As the driver pulled the vehicle smoothly away from the curb, leaving the ruined Silas Empire far behind us in the rearview mirror, I looked directly into the tinted reflection of the window. They used to laugh when I had nowhere to go. Now they have nowhere to hide. I was not looking for forgiveness. I just bought back my justice.